Good evening. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you. Yay, Jennifer. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining. My name is Ashley Gordon. I'm the artistic director of Castle of Our Skins. Before we dive into what I know will be a really rich conversation, I want to give a little bit of context on Julia Perry, our highlighted composer. We do have a cart, so if you would like to and need to come up, we have some chairs here, so please feel free. Okay. 2024 marks Julia Perry's 100th birth year, with March 25th being her actual birth date. A number of celebrations have taken place in honor, including a week-long festival in London, a multi-pronged tribute in New York City, and concert performances taking place this weekend in St. Louis, Missouri, and here in Boston. Her life, music, and legacy have been documented in several books by such scholars and authors as Eileen Southern, the first African-American woman tenured in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, and Helen Walker Hill. You may be asking, so what? Who is Julia Perry, and why are so many people interested in her? Julia Perry was born in Lexington, Kentucky on March 25th, 1924, the fourth of five sisters to an upper-middle-class family and musically enthusiastic Black family. At the age of 10, she moved to Akron, Ohio, where she studied voice, piano, and violin, and was known as an outgoing, cheerful, aggressive tomboy by her childhood friend and cellist, Kermit Moore. She received her training at Westminster Choir College in New Jersey, studying composition, voice, piano, violin, drama, and conducting. She graduated with her bachelor's degree in 1947. The same year, Carl Fisher published her first work, a choral piece entitled Carillon Hi-Ho. She spent 2 summers at Tanglewood studying choral singing, conducting, and composition, and many years later in Europe, writing, performing, and studying with Nadia Boulanger and Luigi Dalla Piccolo, among others. Julia was a conductor and the only Black female conductor active during the mid-century years. She was known to many as Maestra and prided herself on her, quote, Toscanini precision and Stokowskian grace. She wrote dramatic works, including a 3-act play, an epic poem entitled Graves of Untold Africans, and about 100 other works ranging from sacred and secular songs to chamber works, symphonies, operas, and concertos. About half of those works were lost due to lack of preservation or cataloging efforts. Of those that survived, only about a dozen or so are published. The rest are now, or most hopefully, are now in the hands of Ademus Publishing Company, who, over the next 5 years, will be releasing them to the global music community through Boozy and Hawks. That deserves a round of applause right there. A 2-time Guggenheim Fellowship recipient, Julian's health went south in her late 30s. She suffered from acromegaly, if I pronounce that correctly, which is a hormonal disorder that causes the bones in one's body to enlarge. In her 40s, she suffered a series of strokes that left her paralyzed on her right side. Determined to continue to compose, Perry taught herself how to write with her left hand. By this point, her scores were so illegible that she needed to write the note names in her manuscript and often sent messages of apology for their poor condition. Yet, years later, she determinedly sent her scores to colleagues, publishers, composers, and conductors for their consideration to program and record. She, who is celebrated and reached international success in her 30s with her career-launching work, Stabat Mater, which you can hear this Sunday at 1:30 at the Gardner. She was quickly met with a slew of no's in her 40s and 50s from a musical community unprepared and ill-equipped to support her. She died from cardiac arrest in 1979 at the age of 55, a Black disabled woman who had fallen into obscurity, social isolation, and severe economic hardships. So what makes her so interesting? I think musicologist Helen Walker Hill said it best, and to quote, "Her remarkable career began before the civil rights era, while de facto segregation was still the norm in the North, as well as the law in the South, and Black performers had difficulty gaining access to opera houses or concert stages. By mid-century, she was acknowledged as one of a handful of significant American composers, whether Black or female, whose music not only was performed frequently in Europe and the United States, but also was published and recorded. She drew on the strengths and musical traditions of her African American heritage, competed successfully in the white mainstream musical world, and gained an international reputation as a composer of undisputed talent and skill in an eclectic 20th century musical language. This achievement was not only impressive, but also subversive, a challenge to the status quo without being intentionally political. Her tenacity and perseverance in continuing to compose and to pursue performances and publication, despite ill health, social and political upheaval, public ignorance, and rejection, is deeply moving and inspiring. So to help bring Perry's life, legacy, and work into the 21st century and discuss the intersectionality of race, gender, and disability in music, we've brought together a pretty amazing panel of noted advocates, artists, and thought leaders. We have Keith Jones, President and CEO of Soul Touching Experiences, an organization that brings perspective to the issues of access, inclusion, and empowerment, which affect people with a disability as well as other marginalized communities. As an African American activist, entrepreneur with cerebral palsy, and advocate for independent quality living, Mr. Jones has participated in various issues that face people with disabilities, including, but not limited to, housing, education, and voting access. He is active in multicultural cross-disability education efforts and has performed trainings with the purposes of strengthening outreach to provide services and information to people with disabilities. Next to Keith, Adrian Anantawan, who is a violinist who has performed extensively in Canada as a soloist, as a cultural ambassador in the 2006 Athens Olympics, and for such celebrities as Pope John Paul II and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He helped create the Virtual Chamber Music Initiative, a cross-collaborative project that brings researchers, musicians, doctors, and educators together to develop adaptive musical instruments for young people with disabilities. He is also the founder of the Music Inclusion Program, which aims to have children with disabilities learn instrumental music with their typical peers. Throughout the year, Mr. Anantawan continues to perform, speak, and teach around the world as an advocate for disability and the arts. Aja Burrell Wood is the managing director for Berklee's Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice. She oversees the day-to-day operations of the Institute and collaborates with founder and artistic director Terry Lynn Carrington on developing curriculum, programs, and initiatives, in addition to teaching courses related to gender and justice in jazz. Ms. Wood is an ethnomusicologist, educator, and curator whose work includes research on musical community among Black classical musicians, women in jazz, jazz in the digital era, music and civic engagement in Harlem, and other related genres of the African diaspora, such as blues, hip-hop, soul, and West African traditions. And our moderator, Christopher Robinson, is the co-founder and vice president of Think Outside the Vox, a nonprofit, disability-centered arts access consultancy that teaches disability-centric access practices while simultaneously training marginalized access providers. He is also the coordinator of outreach and training of disability and access services for Boston University. While Mr. Robinson has over 30 years of experience in access mentoring work as an ASL English interpreter, as a national presenter on inclusion practices in the performing arts and cross-cultural meditation within deaf and hearing communities. He is a nationally recognized speaker and trainer for disability justice, deaf equity, and anti-ableism practices, as well as a renowned performance ASL interpreter. Christopher, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. How are we doing? Is the mic hot? How's the audio? Okay, let's resonate. So yes, there's a menu of credential right here in front of this stage, but let's make it a bit more conversational. I actually spoke with the panelists and said that we're intentionally going to look toward each other, allow you to eavesdrop, but we're talking to you. There may be some things that we would essentially say in the green room, you know, how the writer's room, we say some provocative things that we just don't get to say out in public as much as we want to. So it's going to be a non-threatening conversation, a provocative conversation possibly, and feel free to be comfortable, a little bit uncomfortable, as you get your bravery ready for the Q&A portion. All right? How's that for framing? All right, great. All right, so the high line, the water line of provocative. Just give you a little anecdote, then we're going to go right into the conversation. All right? My Uncle Joshua walked into the living room. My cousins and I were sitting in there. We were about 13, 14 years old. We were watching Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. So I heard a little
It's a good one.
Good, all right. So that's the kind of texture we're trying to create in the room, all right. Walks into the room, we're watching this piece. Notice I'm centering a piece of art as a part of the paradigm shift that's about to happen. He says, he leans into us. Of course, we had the Gumby Doos. Remember when you were wearing those things? And he says, the civil rights movement, young man, was the worst thing to happen to me as a black man. Okay, now wait a minute. So we're scratching our heads. Where is this going? Where is this coming from? Yes, two things. He was intentionally trying to be provocative, and he was also trying to make us modest in saying that before that legislation was passed, there was signage everywhere. Drink out of this water fountain, enter this door, exit this door, you can go in here, colored only, whites only, signage everywhere. Legislation passes, and he doesn't know where he can go to get a bowl of soup without any spit in it. So my uncle used the opportunity while we were already engaged in an artistic experience. The chest cavity was open. Okay. So that's where we're hoping to create here this evening. The chest cavity, the mind cavity of the arts. We got you open. Let it saturate, okay? All right, thank you for, let me give that framing. So we're going to go right in, essentially 3 questions, but we'll navigate it as a conversation. First being, genuinely, what brings you here to this conversation? We've headlined the intersection of race, identity, and disability and what have you, but genuinely, what brings you here to this conversation? Asia?
My life.
Okay, valid, and let's go, bye-bye, good night.
My joy and my purpose. As we've read out the bio, so no need to go over, I think, those things. But through my career, I come to still sometimes come across these people whose names have not been raised up thoroughly. And I'm not talking about the amazing scholars who make sure that we do know Julia Perry's name, but it's just such a pattern, right? And how much I would have loved to have known her work and name as a young black girl in Detroit, Michigan. And that's why I'm always glad to be lifting everyone every time we can, these names and the works up. And then personally, I'm personally here because also Julia Perry has me reflecting on some notes of the melodies of my own life, in that my mother was a disabled Black woman. Also, she played the piano, although I never got to hear her play, but she did teach me how to read music, and just would be just a generation after Julia Perry. Like Julia Perry would be around the same age as my grandmother, and passed away also from a heart, eventually a heart condition, which is still, heart disease is still a major issue for Black women in America. It is still something that we are contending with and that can take us out often. So those points of intersectionality, I am a daughter of a woman who had similar intersectionalities. I'm a proud daughter of a woman who had similar intersectionalities. So that also brings me here, and to the extent that I can be in community with everybody today and lend to our collective understanding and expansion of understanding, I'm very honored to do so.
Thank you so much. I want to put a highlight on the point about the reference to your childhood. You know, had you been exposed to Julia Perry in childhood, not that you're not accomplished now, of course, but what a remarkable pivot in life that would have made then. So we're going to segue and keep going a bit on that theme of what brings you here, but notice how childhood or proximity to children and youth and that work is going to be a reoccurring theme. Adrian, what brings you here?
Yeah, so like Aja was just saying, I think there's such an intersection here between very universal experiences, that of music, that of identity, especially as it relates to disability. I think that one thing that we have to continue to highlight is everyone will experience a disability at some point in their lives. And the discussion about what music means and what disability means and all that encompassing together is really just thinking about who we are as a species. So this is a very broad question, and everyone sees it from a very unique vantage point, but at the same time one that is broad enough that we can all, as you were just saying, find resonance with each other. So I'm resonating with your idea of thinking about if Julia Perry had existed earlier, how that might have inspired you to do different things or take...
Had I been aware.
Oh, had you been aware? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think about my own experiences as a young person. It was because I had seen a man on Sesame Street. Ishak Perlman?
Yes.
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 Very incredible violinist, grew up with polio, and I was seeing this man struggle to get up a stage with crutches, and then he sits down and picks up a violin and then just flies
I recall
around.
that.
Yeah.
I really actually recall that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was an incredible moment for me because at a certain point I just didn't know the way forward as a musician, especially when I was in 5th grade. My teacher wanted me to play the recorder, accessible in some respects, but not for all my fingers.
Right.
And I think about that, like if I had not encountered that version of what disability can mean in a very contextual, very social capacity, I don't think I would be playing the violin. So in many ways, I think having conversations around Julia Perry or accessibility as it relates to representation, part of the reason I'm here is to ensure that what we're doing, our identities and why we're here are not exceptions,
Right.
but just the baseline norm of what excellence can mean or look like,
Yeah.
especially within the field of classical music, which has a lot of intersections of exclusion in
Yeah.
many different contexts. So being able to frame this conversation as it relates to this incredible, now discovered and uncovered musician is something that I bring with a lot of curiosity and a lot of listening, and I feel like I have so much to learn from both of you, so I'm excited.
That's good.
Beautiful. You heard that little bit of childhood reference there, okay? All that bouncing ball. Mr. Keith Jones, what brings you here, sir?
A lift. No,
Actually, I don't know.
no,
Sometimes the lift doesn't show up.
what brings me here? I think one of the things is that, so I got to Boston in 1981. I'm born in St. Louis. My grandmother sat me at the piano, because we went to church Monday to Monday. And you couldn't get away with it. Music was always a part of the existence. But much like Miss Perry, and much like what we're hearing now, first generation born with the right to vote. Second generation out of sharecropping. First generation to be included in education. So when you talk about music, my escape or my joy was listening to Stax records as my mama Queens on Saturdays. I'm running around in my dun-dun-dun, being, looking like a superhero. But music was always that, because it was the one place you could be and not have to worry about being black, being disabled, being poor, being these things. What was the expression of how do you get here? And the journey has been crazy because every step has been the first. So not my choice.
Right.
So if you coming out of St. Louis in the 70s, I lived in Ferguson. So if you know Michael Brown, that's 2 blocks from my house. You talk about, so the realities of hearing Miss Perry in the 40s and the 50s and knowing if you're in Ohio, you are a descendant of the Great Migration.
Yeah.
Right? If you know that when you said about your father, of the story you gave about not knowing where you can go, that's today. That was me coming here yesterday. So music has always been sort of like a soundtrack. So whenever things get bad, you put on the music. Things get good, you put on the music. I came across Joe Tex this morning, listening to James Brown, but also coming to Boston and seeing how, depending on who's teaching you music, do they see my humanity? Or we can't teach you piano because you play with your feet. So if I'm playing the guitar with my feet, people are like, oh my God, that's amazing. Jesus, oh my God. But then at the same time, I'm broken because my disability is so visible. And so the journey about my music has always been trying to overcome that. Not because I'm not liking them myself, but because the projection that people have in your fragility. And so imagining how people who are born with a disability versus how people acquire a disability. How do you move through your life? So being here and having this discussion is just like you say, I just want to get to the point we can just be. So it's not anything other than that. I don't have to like you, just be, right? And so when I hear these things about intersectionality, identities, people forget that these terms are only 20 years old. These terms are 15 years old. When you talk about disability inclusion, that was mainstreaming in the 80s and the 70s. Yeah. When you talk about accessibility, those terms culturally, even here in the state of Massachusetts, all of these things are literally just now getting legal enough to get a drink. So they're not, so when people have these discussions, they're like,
You know how to spin some yarn, don't you?
right? But it's, and you step back, so even coming down here, we're at the Mass College of Art. Yeah. High school, 15 years ago, I wish 15 years ago, in the 80s, this was black. This was Mission Hill. This was New Edition. This was, going down in how music, depending on where you listen to it, can frame society's mood about my disability or my humanity. In the 80s, is I wore a hoodie doing hip hop. It's the Club City. We couldn't wear hoodies on Mass Ave. You could not go down you couldn't go down 8th Street without people throwing stuff at your butts. So music has always been that kind of like escape of it's crazy. But if I go put on James Brown and Parliament Funkadelic, I'm all right. Even Paul McCartney and Wings, right? But then you start thinking about the component of ethnicity, how the terminologies of blue-eyed soul, right? Black radio, people don't remember that WILD went off at 4 p.m. in the winter. So it's, where do you find, how do you live in joy when everything about your existence is being constructed as negative? So doors don't open for you, cabs don't open for you. So what brings me here is, how do we give kids or people or families, you all, a place to constantly be able to find joy amidst the chaos of somebody who, because of your human condition, has decided you're not worthy of playing a violin, learning the piano. I did ballet at the Strand Theater. Please don't show the pictures, but you know how hard it is to be gangster in tights, but...
No, you can pull it off. So, the bouncing ball of youth.
Yeah.
We're going into that provocative place. Question to the general audience by a show of hands or however you want to shout. Who in here is an educator or in proximity to education? Okay, all right. So in that elevation of your hand or in that elevation of your voice, I see that in a dotted way there's approximately half of folks here in the room. Intentionally listen to our panelists and learn about the possibility of what you can do to pivot what you're going to do tomorrow. Learn about what you could possibly do that's validating in terms of how you educate, but you didn't realize that for our colleagues here looking back in a reflective way, that might have been the intentional deal breaker or magic maker. Right? So that you can bake that in and repeat. So going back to youth, these pivotal moments in your youth, and then maybe drive it toward what we're doing with young people now. Right. Your youth, young people now. I only found out, to be candid, about Julia Perry because I was invited to facilitate this panel. I was in my own little cultural sphere, right? So in terms of your youth, individuals that kind of brought you out, you mentioned we dabbled in Sesame Street a little bit here, but that's through a screen, right? There's distance and not proximity. So who was influential? Where did the pivot, the jettison come from that was actually proximic to you in your childhood, your education? That led you to, like you said, this is why I'm here today.
I'm not, there's many people. I think also what led me here today were these massive questions, like an itch on your back that you can't reach, but it's always there. Of course, the joy and the love and of music and the curiosity that was always very intense with me, but also some anger. And that also that anger of getting to, a proud Detroiter. Anybody that knows me knows I'm insufferable about that. I am a proud alum of Howard University. Anybody that knows me knows I'm insufferable about that as well. Proudly, unapologetically. And my performance background is as a violinist, now an ethnomusicologist. I would say I'm a recovering violinist. That's another panel.
Nothing personal.
Nothing personal. No, I know it's still my tribe. No, for real. But I got to Howard and I took this course in Blacks in the Arts. Actually, so I'll say someone in the late great Professor Selman, and there was a class which one could take, and you went through all the arts, music and everything. But we came across, he brought up William Grant Still, and I was angry because I was like, how am I just now? And you'll see me walking all up and down these Detroit streets with my violin. Came all the way down to D.C. with my violin. And know you're just telling me now. And you see, I'm black, and he's like, what? I was anger.
So the education experience isn't always emotive, joyful.
I know.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, what else are you not telling me?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so what else are you not telling me? Leads me on to ethnomusicology, also considering, hey, Matt, we might want to consider like the global majority and not just what's going on in West and Western influence spaces. So all of that, I think. And then, but for me, I think a beauty of the journey is I keep meeting my teachers along the way at the right time. I think it's, like that adage, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And I've been in teaching in collegiate spaces for, I'll be close to 20 years now, probably by 2026, I'll be knocking on 20 years as a college educator in the span of that time. And so yes, I'm an educator now. I was also raised by educators, but I'm always a student. And my students have been also, and in particular in this conversation that we were having, another time I got angry was, righteous rage. I got, about maybe 8 years ago or so, before I came here to work at Berklee, and I was at Brooklyn College Conservatory of Music, and I received a student who was who had a visibility disability, right? Which actually, as we've discussed before, I didn't even realize that that's actually even the preferred disability in music spaces. So there is issues and things of privilege. That's
I don't know. Speak it again.
So
there are issues with what?
Well, when we do accept disability, what are the preferences surrounding that? And let's
That's
also,
a thing.
That's a thing. And also let's talk about I should have glasses on. I don't have them on right now. But people that wear glasses, we don't even see ourselves as disabled, but that is an ability issue. But it had taken me that long to even have a student put in front of me, and I was given that student because now I'm telling it, but some other people did not want to change what they had to do in the classroom to accommodate this student. I took it as an opportunity because because I'm always going to want to be a better educator than I was yesterday. So I'm thinking, okay, let me figure this out, let me do this, and I will learn and I can accommodate the student. So I did, but I was angry because I had to start thinking, even though that is a preferred disability in music, how long did it take me to have a blind student? So who's
Become aware.
even to have one in my classroom? That was my first one. So, and I had been teaching already for at least a decade by then. So the anger is who's in the room, who's not in the room that we aren't considering, and but also there's so many reasons why that would be the case, because there's so many obstacles and impasses before that student can even get to college, be accepted into college, be able to navigate college, be accommodated by their professors and their chairs and their deans. All of that has to be in place, and often it's not. That's why that was the first time I believe that I had a blind student, and that also led to anger, and but also growth for me, and also bringing that into my work and my mission, and even at the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice at Berklee. We are going from a Black feminist thought lens. We are considering gender equity, racial equity, but also from the aspect of I cannot be free unless we are all free. So that is infused into my daily show up, if you will, in my life, in the work I do.
I appreciate it so much, especially the contextualization that student, the blind student, had gone through a gauntlet prior to arriving in your classroom.
Yep.
So there's nothing indicative about that student's experience that is about weakness or resilience or inability to navigate to the space that they were worthy of being amongst the other peers in your classroom. So youth, thank you for the anger moment there. And feel free to jump in and add to it. Youth, reflecting on your own icons that you were in proximity to, and what are we doing now with young people?
Well, I'm just reflecting on your idea of anger, but it's also an anger that is rooted in such a deep love for what you consider just.
Yeah.
And I think about proximity and youth, and I think for all of us, family
Yes.
might come to mind
absolutely.
as well. And thinking, as you were just saying, Keith, about like why are some of these terms like accessibility, inclusion, now, or intersectionality becoming these terms over the last 20 years. And of course, there's that intersection of policy, the ADA, for instance, and then you think about educational policy, which is or has always been moved forward by parents and those who have a personal stake, because I think a lot of the times it's very difficult for a child, for instance, to be able to advocate for themselves. And when I do a lot of this work centering around young people with disabilities, some of them might be nonverbal. Some of them are just trying to show you like what they need. And at the same time, the strongest advocates and the strongest difference makers that are going to be working within the adult sphere are going to be parents. And there are times where it's a very loving and joyous process. And there are times where there's a lot of resistance
Yes.
along the way. And in order to sort of fight against that resistance, you need like that mentality of like, this is my child and I'm going to make this happen.
Absolutely.
And when you see that as a collective of individuals and advocates, that's where you really find the power and that sort of movement go forward in a society where it's very easy to, as you were just saying, like there's so many different types of disabilities. Some are very visible and some are completely invisible too. But I think about, at least for me, my family probably was the first instance of when I really felt a sense of knowing that at least I was safe within the home. Because I did have a visible disability. In kindergarten, I was like playing by myself all the time, and there are just a lot of social challenges looking differently. And you think that kids are wonderful, and but they come with a lot of biases and assumptions and fear sometimes as well. And for me, like having my parents not only advocate for like being able to play the violin, it was like a really I don't know, radical thing too, because I think that the trumpet or the drums might have been more useful in some respects, but they came from this attitude first of disability is not something that is my problem per se, and what we're doing is trying to think from the highest possible set of values first. The violin was something that was the most beautiful instrument for me, not the most practical one in the end. And when we think about accessibility in particular, like what is the bare minimum? And then what's sort of like normed in some respects, and where do you just like go for it? And as you were just saying, like this truest expression of humanity, when we think about teachers in particular, the ones that have affected me the most, my parents, for instance, or those who have really challenged me, are the ones who really came in with this attitude of like a higher realization of who I could be versus like what could be the norm or what was average in the end. And I think just starting from that vantage point first really allowed me to just have the capacity to just find the space to be able to explore that. Yeah. And there was never a sense of expectation that I would be brilliant at anything, but at least there was space and room to be able to make mistakes, to be able to grow, to be able to be in an environment where it wasn't like all the barriers or obstacles were removed.
Right.
But I was thinking about the exact same problems as any other young person learning music. It's like, well, how do you play this thing? How do you use your imagination?
How do you
Physicality.
vibrato? Yeah.
Exactly. And that very, how can I say, intimate relationship between this object, physicality, emotions. And that exercise, I think, is something that was personal for me, but it's personal for everyone too. We're all built slightly differently anyway. So I think if you assume that that's going to be the norm, then where is the ceiling? And how do you enable young people in particular to access that? So I think that proximity for me has always been, just very close to home. And family for me has been always the greatest source, and still is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm loving this.
Absolutely.
Pendulum is swinging in this way. I'm Christopher Robinson. People think of Winnie the Pooh when they think of Christopher Robinson. So I'm always this optimistic kind of person. But I find it very compelling to have conversations about the grittier, sometimes the darker, practical, very specific things. And this idea of removing the obstacles was not necessarily optimal.
Right.
But we're talking about accessibility, and just by default we think of, barrier removal, barrier free, clean slate, just remove all the barriers. For those of us who might be liberal in our actions, I don't mean that ideologically or politically, I mean, let's invade, create, pick up, and move things literally, without having that conversation that kind of impacted my Uncle Joshua. All the signs were taken down and I didn't know about my own safety. So still opening up this conversation about youth, forward to how we're impacting youth, all right? And we're gonna start to land the plane a little bit more about, Julia. If Julia were here today, if there was the context that we have today, what would the Julia Perry be? All right, we're gonna go there. Your youth, what are we doing with you? And is just removing all the obstacles? Isn't that what the IEP, the ADA says we ought to do?
Hell no.
Uh-oh.
I'm sorry. To contextual.
Yes.
The Brown-Slurton Board of Education decision was 1954. The Board of Education was saying, if you let colored students in, then you're going to want crippled kids in your class. So we don't want neither one of you to come. So I was like, well, damn, I'm stuck. All right. But then you get to 1974, you have the the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, you have the Education Act, which basically allowed me to be legal in classrooms. Those regulations did not get implemented until 1979, which means I was 10. So when you talk about a child and the barriers, and again, we're framing this in the 21st century where we have accessibility, we have ADA. You were a handicapped child, and you went to a special school, and you were not expected. So the barriers were, and they gave us music classes. Tommy had the xylophone. Keith, your feet are ashy. We're going to give you the ukulele, right? But the challenges weren't me. The challenges were, as I asked educators, you can either be a launching pad or you can be a brick wall.
Yep.
Which one do you want to be?
Yep.
Every person can remember in their educational journey the teacher that inspired them or made you want to go home? Which one do you want to be? So when it came to me and my music, again, there was no, I was the first basically everywhere. So when I showed up, it was like, what the hell? But I had no choice because my mama wanted to sleep and I needed to get the hell out of her house. So she would put me in these places where black disabled children were not. So if you're going to school in upstate New York, so the people that influenced, I was lucky enough, you might have known Lawrence Watson, who was a professor at Berkeley, stepdad. So
Yes, we know.
so in the 70s, they would do things in Cornell. And so as a kid, I'm hanging around James and Janice Turner, Baldwin, Larry, my mama, these people are now holding up their icons. I'm running around the house, getting on their nerves because I'm bumping into the turntable, knocking over Frankie Beverly and Mays. And so the journey was never really about me. It was mom, like you said, family, my grandmother. These are people who were in the days where they would have traveling evangelists. My grandmother played the piano, needed to play the piano, but people would want to pray for her grandbaby. Going to school, coming to Boston in the 80s, going to do ballet at the Strand it wasn't that we couldn't do it. My mother was like, go, because I'm tired. And as long as the babies ain't in the house, she can sleep. And so it crystallized when you talk about what we're doing for the kids. I didn't know as a young person how impactful me being in the room was. Because my friend who I got off the phone with when I went to college in Ramapo, they said they had never been to school with kids with disabilities. Or if they did go, we were in that room. We were in the fishbowl. You'll see the prom season. Oh my God, look at little Susan. He has a date. It's because they didn't see us as artists. So I'm hanging with the Clark sisters, right?
Wow.
And I like being the badass kid, sitting in the back, right? And hanging, there's Mahalia Jackson, there's Shirley Chisholm, there's all these people around. And when I look back on it, the journey was that these are black people who were the first generation of the Great Migration. And so you're coming up and you're seeing yourself gain the right to vote, gain the right to civil rights. And now here comes your child with the cerebral palsy, and now you're right back to no rights. And so, real quick anecdote, my mother took me to child. They asked her at 13, what was your plan for your child? She said he's going to graduate high school, graduate college, and get the hell out of my house. And then they sent her to a psychologist because they said her expectations were unreal. The psychologist said, he's going to graduate high school, graduate and get the hell out of my house. And they wanted to prescribe her medicine because they thought she was delusional. And this is so again, this is not 100 years ago. This is 10 years after Miss Perry died. So you start thinking, when we talk about what are we doing for kids, I actually taught access to theater at the Cyclorama for 20 years. The kids, including with and without disabilities, and showing them, directly or indirectly, that your humanity is what matters. So do you want to sing? You ain't good at it, but you can sing, baby. You can sing, right? If you want to dance, you ain't got no rhythm, but that's okay. It wasn't about if you were perfect. It was about, are you being expressive? Because kids with disabilities, we are not allowed to be expressive, particularly if you are a person of color. I can't tell you how many times I got put out of class. At West Roxbury High School, that no longer exists, the teacher was like, aren't we all handicapped? I was like, no. What the hell wrong with you? The only one crazy is the one sitting behind the desk. Get out of class. They said I had a low IQ and sent me so there are real world consequences to just basking in your humanity. Never mind the fact that I just wanted to, I thought I could break dance. We're not going to talk about that. But rapping and singing and dancing were things that oh, that's what kids with disabilities would do because that's the only profession you can have. That's why the term handicap is cap in hand. It's you had to shake your hat to get changed because there was no vocal rehabilitation. Like I'm listening to you on that, and it's all flooding back to those teachers who would look at you and didn't want you in the class. Mm-hmm. Teachers, when you talked about students getting to math, you can't. What is the disability enrollment here? Boston has 355 colleges and universities, and the academic enrollment of students with disabilities is 3%. So that's not because the kids woke up and was like, to hell with it, I don't want to go to college. Mm-hmm. It's because academia has said, if you come into the classroom, it's kind of hard to sneak in a wheelchair, but you look back and say, so when kids see me now, they, oh, I didn't know you rap. Yeah, I rap. I didn't know you say, yeah. And they are amazed because they had never seen it. Or even now you're not seeing it. And when you do see it, it's the Stevie Wonders. It's the Ray Charles. It's the Blind Furies in hip hop. Mm-hmm. It's that very specific, or now you're neurodivergent, right? These very specific lanes of, quote, acceptable disability that are the challenges.
You know what's funny too is it's not funny, but what's coming up for me as I'm listening to you too is some of the most recent advances in accessibility in education, college, but I'm sure for K through 12 as well, I believe has actually been due to the pandemic.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I had a friend who during the pandemic, we were all on our Zoom, right? And went to a discussion, virtual discussion on Black feminist thought. And the idea is that had we already been operating as a society from a Black feminist thought lens, meaning considering intersectionality, people think Black feminist thought just means things for Black women. It's like, no, if we come through liberation from this, yes, at least this lens, it actually ends up benefiting everybody. And so had we been in that mindset, whatever you want to call it, a lot of the things that we quickly established, and remember quickly, I know sometimes you don't want to remember March 2020, yes, but y'all remember how, yeah. And it was a whirlwind, but all of a sudden, nobody was thinking about Zoom, then we have Zoom, right? Skype totally missed out on that, I don't know. None of my business. None of my business. But anyway, yes, we had Zoom. We had certain delivery services, certain, banking, and even courts. People were doing court on
yes.
Zoom. There are so many accessibility. A lot of these things are accessibility points, and also as being, an employee and educator at Berklee College of Music, I got to see up close and personal what we were doing surrounding the arts, right? Mm-hmm. And arts education space. So there's also a lot to consider for that. And you know how much mouth stuff that in music happens in music? We had to figure ourselves around. But anyway, but the thing is, the disability community has been yelling from the rooftop for decades for those exact same resources, for books and articles or whatever resources to be digitized, for certain accommodations to be made in the classroom, for to consider space in different ways. People have been screaming, but it wasn't until we were all impacted where we were like, oh, you know what we should do?
Oh my God.
And it wasn't like, I could be wrong, but it didn't seem like we came up with anything that wasn't already proposed, at the very least, by the disability community. So what if we went from that standpoint, because also in considering the life and work of Julia Perry, as you were, getting to our next question of what would it be for her today? But I think about the way that even from going from thinking about people who are disabled, but to be thinking about how society constantly and continually disables people.
Yes.
And we don't treat it like that. We lay the disability at the person's feet. It's their thing, it's their problem. You know, like they say, like your mother was delusional because they're also laying it at your mother's feet.
Yeah.
But we never lay it at like our collective
Right.
feet. But that's where I believe it really belongs, because we are actively disabling people. And if we could think about that versus people being disabled. So I see Julia Perry's life in the way that she was being disabled by her context, by the history, by society at the time. And unfortunately, I think she still would, to a degree. There's advances, though. I hope that she would also have found more community. Sustainability.
I want to ask about the community piece, and there are some practical, measurable things that, in terms of implementing. I'm asking specifically to think about some of the things you actually take for granted that are intentional, accessible, inclusive, but our general audience may not be a light bulb moment for them. So the question is, if Julia were alive today, what assets and thinking might have been available to Julia, or the context of Julia, that may have leveraged her accessibility and not put her in such a space of obscurity that 100 years later we're having this conversation of exhuming her versus just celebrating her.
Well, that's an interesting question. Don't mean to leapfrog, but when is she born? Is she born in the 80s? Is she born in the 90s? Is she born post-ADA, pre-ADA? Is she born No Child Left Behind? She born, we don't give a damn about the child. So is she born in the Midwest? Because specificity about your disability, you have to understand, people with disabilities, you can't have more than $5,000 in the bank. You can't get married. You can't cohabitate with somebody who's receiving benefits. If people who get sick, if Julia had a stroke and was married and she needed mass health, today she would have to get divorced in order for her to qualify to be covered for mass health. In terms of her barriers, like I'm looking at a black woman in the United States. If you're talking about liberation, everybody has said it. I'm a proud son of the black mama. Like, if you solve it for black women, you solve it for everybody. That has been the ideology for 100 years. So if she was here today, like, honestly, if you think about it, does mass art have a inclusive educational model? Because the principles are universal design. So those principles have been around since the late 90s. And again, so there's nothing new. What has happened is that we're not talking about power right now. There's a power in this, like when you talk about debility. There's a power in not making yourself accessible. Somebody said, well, we don't never see you in here, and Keith, you should come in. That's because you got 13 steps. I mean, I could get up, but I'm lazy as hell. Put a ramp, right? But people have forgotten that bias is not gone. The people that were trying to stab people with flags on City Hall in 1974 in Boston are still here. Their children are working at these colleges. They are educating in Boston public schools. So if she's alive today, are we talking about BPS saying, here is these accommodations, IEPs, so sign language interpreters, CART reporters, do you get your books on tape? Mass Commission for the Blind, if I needed a textbook from here, you would have to, and it's a 6-month thing. Like, all of these things are in place, but when were you born? Where were you born? Were you born on the Cape? Are you Cape Verdean? Are you Dominican? Are you a Haitian immigrant? Are you from Latvia? Like, all of those things. And so if you're not a PhD in survival, you just take what is presented to you. And so it is on our mothers, our fathers, our families to instill in us, okay, look, these out here is crazy. So here's your armor. The best way to do it is the black mother talk to her black son, or the black mother talk to her black daughter. When you go out this door, this is how they see you. This is what you're gonna need to keep in yourself. So I think she would be great. I think she would have more technology to be more expressive, so her music would not have been lost. But even digitizing music didn't really get popular until 2003. So it's those kind of things that I think people in these educational spaces, because my parents were educators. So, you know, you come in and colleges have their traditions and things like that, but are we seriously here for education? Are we here for status? Are we here for inclusion? Are we here just to get another grant? So Julia Perry would be an amazing person, but where was she born? Was she born in Dorchester or was she born in Winthrop?
Thank you so much for that framing. And there was a show of hands of educators in the room. Show of hands or shout for individuals who are in proximity to identify as artists.
Okay.
So your educators, what are we going to do tomorrow to allow what you do, the way you do it, to allow any one of us to walk into that space, roll into that space, occupy that space? Or is it framed exclusively for you? As we were talking about, it is inevitable that the arc of humanity lands on disability. So are the circumstances of now available to us for the inevitable? Going back, Adrian, if you want to throw in, what might be different for Julia now from your perspective? Thinking also about what it is you do, that you create inclusive spaces. You may take it for granted, but our friends here, it may not have occurred to them.
I love your answer, Keith. I think that we want to be in a space of optimism and hope, and we see many success stories of folks, despite the barriers or challenges in their way, succeeding. I think, as you were saying, there are a lot more tools at folks' disposal, especially when it comes to technology and leveraging that. And again, we're talking about intersectionality. Again, like the work that I do, it's hard sometimes for parents to advocate for their child who might have a disability if they have jobs they're working 12 hours a day. And I certainly see a strata amongst parents who have the resources. I mean, sometimes it's money, but a lot of the times it's just literally just being present, being able to go to the IAP meetings, for instance, being able to buy like the best possible piece of technology, like a wheelchair, for instance, or like a computer program that might be accessible as well. So there are a lot of challenges that are still in our way. I think that it really depends. Like I was just thinking about Berklee, for instance, and like you were just mentioning, 3% of college students have some type of disability here. And that's a lot of people, right? At Berklee, I'm doing some work there right now. It's like, I think of like the 6,000 or 7,000 students that are there are like 1,500 accommodation requests throughout the entire school. And they have like 8 people on their team to be able to sort this through. And who knows what type of class, composition class, she might have been taking at a certain point, for instance, where there, it's very much still, a lot of things have to happen that go well in order for success to happen. And I would like to hope that we're creating as many accessible platforms as possible. But as you were saying, both of you too, this idea of universal design, you would think this would be the space for us to really say, well, of course, right? And yet there are still barriers in the way. And I'm still trying to identify not only you were just talking about the brick wall, right? Just being a very passive object. But like, who are the people who are actively sort of working
Yeah.
against this as well?
Right.
In the name of artistic excellence, for
Yes.
instance, in the name of, well, we've never had someone with a disability walk into
sweet Jesus,
our
yes.
building before, so why make these accommodations? Why have the accessible entrance in the front versus the back, for instance?
Right.
And we're at a really incredible moment where we can make those choices
Yes.
of really setting or planting the seeds of celebrating something that is a very universal and human condition.
Yes.
And I don't think we're anywhere near there yet. And at the same time, I think, and I would hope that there are a lot of people who are doing incredible work that are centered around justice, accessibility, music, and my hope is that Julia would have found some camaraderie
Yes.
through a social media platform, for
Yeah,
instance. Maybe
yeah.
she would have checked out Castle of Our
TikTok,
Skins.
though.
And hopefully she would have came down to Jazz and Dinner Justice as well. To that, because everything I think that we've all been mentioning also point to systemic, right? While we can point out, individuals, a brick wall of a teacher, someone in a community that, was an obstacle, an individual fails. But ultimately, it is systemic, right?
Yes.
And to your point about doing that work of justice, right? At our institute, Angela Davis sits on our board, an advisory board. Angela Davis, Carrie Mae Weems, Dr. Gina Dent, Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin. And why we ended up choosing justice in the name came through a conversation that Terry was having with Dr. Gina Dent. And Angela Davis, and we consider a lot of times, especially in America, I think that, or the United States, when we think about justice, we think about like criminal justice,
Yes.
in that crime and punishment or whatever. But if you really think about justice, it should transform, right, the sets of conditions that create the injustice in the first place. So I'm gonna say that again. Justice is transformative.
Yes.
Okay? And justice should transform the sets of conditions that create the injustice and inequity in the first place. So if I'm thinking about what I can do individually, then what we can do collectively, then where we can blow things up when we need to. I mean, like systemically, these oppressive systems. That's what I'm really, really busy trying to do and thinking, and also being in community about that, because it's also collective work. Is I can't do it, you can't do it individually. Ash, you can't. Love, you can't do it. It has to be all of us together to transform, because that's what Julia deserved, was the transformation, not of herself. No. She did her work. She came, she did her work. Mm-hmm. It's what she deserved, and what the many Julia Perrys across the arts, across the genres deserve, is transformed environments, transformed societies, and our transformed selves. That's what I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you
a little bit more, then we're going to hear from our friends.
But when you were talking about everything, when you're talking about justice, the inclusive spaces. 2009, the United Nations and the World Health Organization changed the definition of disability. Disability is not centered in the person; it's centered in the environment. So I'm not disabled if everything is accessible.
Exactly.
But I am disabled if you keep putting steps, right? I'm not disabled if we have CART, media access, other things. I am disabled if you are like, well, it's too bad for you, blackheads, you couldn't get here anyway. It's those kind of things. And what makes it crazy for us when you talk about justice, particularly for a black woman with a disability, particularly a black woman who acquired a disability, Black women with disabilities are almost never included in the larger black women discussion. They're not almost never talked about how black disabled women today can be sterilized because people don't think black disabled women are women. Like there are larger components, but the joy of it is we got a gang. I know some gangsters. And so I think if she was here now, there is a community. There is you, there is you, there is you. There's this conversation. The work has been done, and justice is transformative. It has to be transformed. But then in the transformation, you go to war and understand that some people are comfortable in not having justice.
Oh, absolutely.
And some people are profitable for not giving justice. So the question is, who benefits from the problem that is being solved? So those are the kinds of things I think Julia Perry, if she was here now, she'd be TikTok famous and rich.
Yes.
But that's me being hopeful. Yeah.
Yes.
So, I would love to hear from some of y'all. We have a microphone for passing around. Is that the protocol? Christopher Robinson here, of course, Think Outside the Box. What we're trying to do in several spaces in collaboration with Cast of Our Skins and some other institutions is perpetuate these conversations so we can get past the disability justice, just the justice, and disability justice, to disability joy, and then joy. All right. So let's open things up and hear from all you, your questions or things you dare to ask in this space of our friends and for each other.
I'm modeling for you to come to the microphone to ask your question so that we can all hear and that our cart provider is able to do her job as well. So if you have a question, feel free to come on up. I'm happy to vamp a little bit and introduce a special guest in the room, but think of your question and please do come on up. I would like to introduce Christiane Berry, who is Julia Perry's niece.
Okay.
And if I could maybe put you on the spot, if you want to talk, since family was brought up and youth was brought up, I don't know if there's any anecdotes, anything from this conversation, any memories that you might want to share, and if not, since I put you on the spot, you don't have to.
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you all the panelists for showing me the intersectionality of all your issues, and helping me to appreciate how my aunt's life is still relevant today. Let's see, do I have any memories I could share? I'm not too sure. I was was a little girl, but thank you. Thank you.
Myself to actually run around and be an accommodation, folks who may not have the circumstance to come up with. But if anything comes to mind, I will Phil Donahue myself back.
What a guy. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Over here. Yes. Thank you for helping me roll. Yes. Oh, you don't have to stand here. Right as you are.
Okay. Hi, my name is Tamia Elliott to all the panelists. I'm a voice principal, and I'm a third semester at Berklee College of Music, and I am in the Jazz and Gender Justice Institute, who Professor Wood is the managing director of. And I just wanted to ask the panelists, or just in general, you don't have to ask if maybe the task is emotionally laboring, but how can the gap between inclusion and the twisted benefits of separation be bridged when navigating the harm of careless equality or uninformed desire in spaces for those who are disabled can be the make or break or the open door? And when we are creating these accommodations for those of us who are disabled or those of us who are not a part of the said disabled community, how can we create the difference of we're not just accommodating the survival of injustice, but actually destroying the injustice?
Wow.
All right.
Wow.
Thank you. I'm processing it as well. There is a question of navigation, a and there's a question of those in proximity to the individuals with disabilities who are navigating, what can we do that's not performative?
Okay.
Yeah.
So so I talk about intentionality. So if you're walking down the street, you can give a damn about whether or not I'm accommodating you. But if you're coming to my classroom, where I'm the teacher, I have to set that intention that every human that walks into my classroom is worthy of equity, is worthy of justice. Regardless if I like you or not, I have chosen to be in this space as your teacher. And it is incumbent upon me as being that person to actively make sure that regardless of where you are on your learning curve, that every part of you is accepted and expected. And that permeates across the classroom, across the coursework. Because what you'll find in education is that there are teachers who do this, but the reason they're stomped down is because the organizational culture is not for that. And that's not because the teacher is wrong, it's because there is a benefit to not making that accommodation. And so to destroy that is to really have to step back. People don't want transformative change because they have a fear. And they have a fear of, and something you'll hear this when they talk about reparations, there's a fear of a retaliation. It's a fear of the power dynamic being flipped. So how do you do those in those spaces? If you're creating that space, be very intentional about where you're holding it, who you're holding it for, how you're embracing their humanity. So there are real practical steps, but humans are humans. And sometimes, Harriet tell me to carry the gun, because you can't save everybody. So, it's just being intentional about inclusion, setting that tone, making sure, because you said it, destroying that so that you're not accommodating the justice.
Thank you for that. I'll add an additional note that we're going to follow up with Councilor Skins, especially in the social media space, to add information, very practical information to answer, some of those questions. One light bulb moment, possible opportunity, especially in the higher ed space, is this: that one not need initiate accommodation in order to experience universal design practices. Often there is a default that I must go through a litigious process in order to approach a professor to say, could we just dim the lights? I do not need to go through a litigious process in order to ask the faculty member, could you invert the PowerPoint slides to be black background but white type text? So you don't need to wait. So let's not get bottlenecked in the litigious work of accommodations and overlook universal design in very practical ways. Other thoughts to talk about the navigation question and what can individuals do in proximity to navigating it?
The only thing that's coming up for me, and to me, an excellent question, the only thing that right now in this moment is from an individual standpoint, to continue to unpack, to unlearn. I think that you have to, I tell this to my students often, and I tell it to me, like, you have to be a super special unicorn to be born in a society that is ableist, that is white supremacist, that is patriarchal, that is classist, that is all of those things. And you somehow are unimpacted by it. You somehow haven't internalized it. You somehow do not carry around those biases. And listen, if you are that super special magic unicorn, listen, come up to the front, learn us in your ways. I'll take notes. But other than that, like, we are all impacted by that. So for me, it feels like continual new learning, unlearning things that are harmful, not useful, never considering that I cannot be a cause of harm, but understand or try to do my best to minimize any harm that I will inevitably cause. without defensiveness. That's where I am today.
Thank you so much.
I can add
Please.
very quickly that what folks can do is also just use whatever gifts they have. If you're a musician, like
Thank you for bringing it back to the arts.
yes.
So, by the way,
Music.
celebrate. I think that
Absolutely.
like we were just talking about the social context of disability and their disabling environments, and that's one sort of level to it. That's like we just need an equal playing field, which is a sense of justice as well. But then when we frame disability as not only something to be compliant with or even like just accommodated, like what are the assets that folks with disabilities are providing into any environment? And as we were just sort of trying to frame that question, like what are we missing out on?
Yeah.
When I think about classical music in particular, whatever I purvey, it's like there are so many celebrations of disruption in our past that we just think are the norm now. And the idea of like anyone coming in with the lens of a particular perception of what it means to be different. These are stories, these are voices, these are ways that we can intersect whatever disciplines we have in order to think about what innovation and creativity actually is. And I think from that mindset, there's a courage that is engendered in terms of, you were just saying, asking questions, listening, and coming in from that with this idea that not only are we absorbing and listening, but all of us are benefiting from these individuals, not from an accommodation perspective, but like we are the ones receiving this gift of their perspective and their ingenuity. And their talents.
Well, you know, we do ask, we have a provocative question that is always in our tagline at the Institute, which is jazz without patriarchy, and what would jazz sound like in a world without patriarchy, a culture without patriarchy. And it's provocative because we've never had that. We don't know what it sounds like. We don't know what it looks like. But we are inviting, you know, our community of artists, musicians, and all to envision and create that. And I think that is a power, to your point about the arts and music. You know, arts and music has changed the world over and over and over again, and can. So I do think this is also quite apropos that these conversations are happening in arts places with artists and with educators, because we are on the front lines of that. And so we don't know what that sounds like yet, but I think we can start to, more than start, to imagine, you know, what that can be. And I think, you know, I can't speak ever, obviously, for the great Julia Perry, but I wonder if she ever wondered, you know, imagined that, you know.
certainly she did, as she was composing and writing to what others perceived as ineligible, you know, unintelligible in terms of the writing, but only if there was certain technology available, you know, to her at a time. Imagine. Other questions over here?
Hi. Hi. I have a question. My name is Elise. I am curious of a point, Chris, that you raised, and a couple of you raised as well, of the importance of seeing disability in childhood, and also that for a couple of you it was removed from a screen, and how that impact could have been helpful earlier on or wherever. And I think that as we're talking about Black disabled women in the arts today, sometimes it can be either from a historical perspective or from far away, and wondering how we can start to bring that conversation a little closer to home, because there are many Black disabled women artists in the Boston area that are doing great work, and for the educators in the room or the students in the room who would love to see that perspective, what are your favorite Black disabled women artists in Boston? I promise that wasn't about me. I'm trying to get.
Unapologetically, Elise Patterson is in the room
Yes, say
and resonates with all the identities that were just
Say that.
within the question. So unapologetically, we uplift. And to the genuine question, who? Are there some who's?
I see. That's dirty, because I love all of y'all. So, but I think one of the things is, yes, at least there are a myriad of places where they're happening. I would hope that we could put on a big festival. Like, I would love to just see a big expression of your work and everybody's work. We can just go, and it's not like, oh my God, the crippled people are dancing. But no, that we are all out there. It's because when you talk about the art, if you don't see that, if you don't see Julia Perry and you hear her music, you're not biased by your perception of her disability. When you see ability dance and the amazingness of the dancer, you are transported and say, oh my goodness. Like, so I'm hoping that there are 1,000 more, because I would like to retire and just watch y'all perform. But I would love to just, because these are the spaces where we can't get into, because there is a privilege of access. And so, but I got a lot of fans, and I'm trying not to get beat up by saying everybody, but it would be great to see you and everybody do this again and again.
Also, mindfully take these articles, which continues to talk about this series, right, where we're elevating, amplifying Julia, and we congregate again in these spaces, and then in that collage of kind of cross-pollinating amongst each other, then we see each other, we get the additional names. Also, there are some other intentions that we can follow through with. For example, in the Boston area, there is a specific instrument online, the Arts Boston Calendar, easy to Google. Arts Boston Calendar. And that instrument allows you to search specifically for the kinds of accessibility programming. What you'd like to know before you go, what kind of restroom accessibility is at this particular venue? Will there be open captioning in a certain place? Oh, I haven't been to a theater and a show, the acoustics in these places ain't so well. If you knew that there was intentional amplification or what have you, then the entire office pool could go, or the family can go. Oh, there's a wedding in town. Well, we can't all go here because of X, Y, Z, but then you come in and say, hey, but here's this option that I researched, right? So there are things like that that you can kind of experience proximity to disability, proximity to accessibility in the arts, by that particular instrument, and of course, attending the series event as well. I'm going to land the plane here, give you a little opportunity to have conversation with each other. Ash, how we doing?
I would like to give a generous shaking of hands, applause, thanking our moderator, thanking our amazing panelists. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Not everyone answered Elise's question, so I would love to hear, and maybe we can have some open conversation if you would like to stay. I do also want to share that if you are curious to hear more about Julia Perry, and I hope everybody here is, this Friday, if you want to drive 4 hours in rush hour traffic to Tanglewood, you can come here, or a little bit closer, literally just kind of on the backside of MassArt at the Gardner Museum. All Julia Perry and the women of her immediate life that had inspired her as well, classmate Irene Britton Smith and her teacher Nadia Boulanger, but a whole afternoon dedicated to her. So very excited again to have you all here, and this officially concludes our panel. But again, conversation, light snacks and refreshment in the hallway. So thank you so much for coming, and again, thank you to our panelists and our moderator.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you. Bravo. Thank you.